Hey everybody, and welcome back to the Deep Dive.
Yeah.
We're diving into a topic today that we've gotten a ton of requests for, the Battle of Waterloo. I'm sure most of you have heard the phrase meeting your Waterloo, but there's so much more to this battle than just a saying. We're going to really get into the details, the personalities, the strategies, and hopefully figure out why Waterloo is still such a big deal even today. And to help us navigate all of this, we've got a real expert in military history, especially the Napoleonic era. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Waterloo really is one of those pivotal moments in history. It's a clash that still has an impact even now, all these years later.
So let's set the scene for our listeners. It's 1815, Napoleon's just returned from exile, and Europe's kind of freaking out. Can you explain why his return was such a big deal?
Well, you gotta imagine, Europe's just starting to recover after more than 20 years of war. The French Revolution, Napoleon's ambition, it all took a toll. When Napoleon was exiled to Elba, everyone thought, okay, that's it, we can finally relax. But then, bam, he's back in France. It's like that one house guest that shows up unexpectedly and just throws everyone's plans into chaos.
Yeah, I can see how that would create some major diplomatic issues. So what happened next? Did everyone just give up and let Napoleon take over again?
Oh, no, not at all. The major powers in Europe, Britain, Prussia, the Netherlands, they weren't about to let Napoleon just stroll back in. They formed this alliance called the Seventh Coalition. They were determined to stop him. And the thing is, they had a lot more troops than the French.
So Napoleon's going into this knowing he's outnumbered.
Yeah.
That's either really brave or incredibly overconfident.
It might have been a bit of both. Napoleon was definitely brilliant when it came to military strategy. He knew he couldn't win a long, drawn-out war against the coalition. His only chance was to attack quickly and decisively before they had a chance to get fully organized. The goal was to catch them by surprise and split their forces.
So he needed a quick win, a knockout punch. And that's where Waterloo comes in.
You got it. Waterloo is south of Brussels. It wasn't really a strategically important place, but it's where Wellington and Blücher's armies were. That's what made it the target. Napoleon wanted to crush those armies before they could join up with the rest of the coalition.
So it was like high-stakes poker, but with entire armies. All right, we've got the setup, the players. Now let's talk about the armies themselves. What were the strengths and weaknesses of each side?
Napoleon's army was called the Armée du Nord. About 74,500 men, most of them experienced veterans who were completely loyal to Napoleon. Their cavalry was really something special, known for their speed and aggressive tactics.
So experience and loyalty on their side. Sounds pretty tough to beat. But you mentioned weaknesses before.
Yeah, well, there were some issues under the surface. They had experienced officers, sure, but a lot of them were new to their units. So the level of trust and teamwork you usually see in a veteran army wasn't quite there. Plus, after years of fighting, France was running out of men and resources. They weren't the unstoppable force they used to be.
Interesting. So a veteran army, but with some possible weak spots.
Mm-hmm.
What about the coalition forces? What were they bringing to the fight?
Wellington had about 74,000 men, about the same size as the French, but his army was way more diverse. It was a multinational force with British, Dutch, Belgian, German, even Hanoverian troops. The British and King's German Legion soldiers were top-notch, but some of the others, especially the Dutch Belgians, were pretty inexperienced.
So experience versus a bit more variety. What about their leadership? Were they as unified as the French under Napoleon?
That's a really important point. The coalition all wanted to stop Napoleon, but having so many different nationalities created problems. Communication wasn't always smooth, and their different military styles sometimes caused friction on the battlefield.
So we have a real clash of styles here. Experienced French troops, but maybe not super cohesive, versus a multinational coalition force with numbers on their side, but less experience. And of course, we can't forget the Prussians. They were part of the coalition too, right?
Oh, absolutely. The Prussians were essential to the coalition's plan. They were commanded by Gebhard Liebrecht von Blücher and had about 48,000 men involved at Waterloo itself. They had veterans, less trained militia, a real mix. They were still reorganizing after the Napoleonic Wars, but their strength was in how well organized their staff system was. Unlike the French, their communication was top-notch. They could react and adapt quickly on the battlefield.
Wow, so we've got Napoleon's veterans, Wellington's multinational force, and the well-organized Prussians. This is shaping up to be one epic showdown. I bet things are about to get really intense.
Yeah, you could say that. There are some key moments in the battle that really highlight the different strengths and weaknesses of each army. These clashes were going to decide not just who won the battle, but the fate of Napoleon, the coalition, and maybe even all of Europe.
I'm ready to hear about them. What were some of those crucial moments, those clashes that had everyone wondering who was going to win?
One of the most famous places where the fighting was really fierce was Hougoumont. It was this small chateau on the far right side of Wellington's line. Both sides ended up pouring troops into fighting for it all day long.
A chateau. You mean like a country house? Why
Yeah.
is that so important?
That's a great question, and it shows how even small things can become really important in a battle. Even though Hougoumont was small, it was a good defensive position. The British saw that and fortified it. It ended up being a real pain for the French.
So this little chateau becomes a major battleground.
Mm.
I'm picturing close quarters combat, desperate defense. Am I close?
Exactly. Think about British troops holding the North Gate against wave after wave of French infantry. There are stories about hand-to-hand fighting, guys literally flooding through the broken gate, a desperate fight in the chateau's courtyard. It was brutal and lasted for hours.
Did the French ever capture Hougoumont?
No, they threw thousands of troops at it, but the British, they held on. Wellington himself later said that the success of the battle turned upon closing the gates at Hougoumont.
That's incredible. Who would have thought a country house would be so important in such a huge battle? Makes you think about how small details can really change things in a war.
That's what's so fascinating about studying history, especially military history.
Yeah.
You see how these seemingly tiny events can have huge consequences. And speaking of dramatic moments, we can't forget the French cavalry charges.
Oh yeah, I've seen paintings of those. Tons of armored cavalry charging uphill. It's an image that's always stuck with me. What was it like to be there?
Just imagine the ground shaking under the weight of thousands of horses, the sun glinting off the armor of the cuirassiers as they charged forward. Napoleon sent wave after wave of them, hoping to break those British infantry squares.
So classic Napoleon, right? Overwhelming force and speed.
You got it. But Wellington's army, even though they had a mix of experience levels, was known for being disciplined and for their firepower. The British squares, those famous formations with bayonets and muskets, they held their ground against those relentless French cavalry attacks.
It must have taken a lot of guts to just stand there against all those horses. Are there any stories about individual acts of bravery that stand out?
There are tons, but one that really captures the spirit of that moment is the story of Captain Mercer's artillery battery. They were ordered to retreat when the cavalry attacked, but Mercer refused. He held his position and kept firing on the French. His defiance and the firepower of his cannons played a big part in stopping those charges.
Now that's holding the line. So even with their speed and power, the French cavalry couldn't break through.
That's right. They caused casualties and messed up some formations, but they didn't achieve their main goal. They faced stubborn resistance and heavy fire. The French cavalry, even though they had all that momentum on the start, was exhausted in the end, and they suffered heavy losses. This was a big turning point in the battle.
It's amazing how Wellington's forces managed to survive those attacks, even when they were outnumbered. Was it just their discipline and firepower, or was something else going on?
That's a great question, and it brings us to another key moment that would change everything. The arrival of the Prussians.
Ah, the Prussians. We can't forget them. What did they do?
Their arrival was crucial. The Prussian, the Fifth Corps, commanded by Friedrich Wilhelm von Bülow, had been working with Wellington beforehand. They hit the French right flank just when Napoleon's attacks on Wellington's center were at their strongest.
That must have been frustrating for Napoleon. Just when you think you're about to win, a whole new enemy shows up. What happened when they arrived?
It completely messed up Napoleon's plan. He had to divert troops to deal with this new threat instead of focusing on Wellington. And this is where the Prussians' superior communication and coordination really made a difference. They were able to maneuver effectively and put more and more pressure on that right flank.
Like a 1-2 punch. The Prussians arriving just as the French are recovering from their failed cavalry attacks.
Exactly. The French were suddenly fighting on two fronts. This is when things really started turning against Napoleon.
So it wasn't just about the size of the armies or how well they fought individually. It was also about adapting and communicating during the battle. The Prussians were really good at that. Okay, so the French cavalry is done. The Prussians are attacking. Napoleon's plans are falling apart. What does he do next? What does he have left to try and save the situation?
Well, things were getting desperate, his plan was crumbling, and Napoleon decided to take a huge gamble. He called on his most elite troops, the legendary Imperial Guard.
The Imperial Guard. Now we're talking. These guys were the best of the best, right? The elite of the French army. I bet Napoleon was hoping they could smash through Wellington's lines and somehow win.
Exactly. The Imperial Guard was more than just an elite unit. They were a symbol of Napoleon's power, of French military might. known for their discipline, their bearskin hats, and their loyalty to Napoleon. Sending them in meant Napoleon was desperate.
I can only imagine what it must have been like to see that, the Imperial Guard marching forward, knowing that everything depended on them. Must have been an incredible sight.
It was a last-ditch effort, a final all-or-nothing attack. Napoleon sent elements of the Middle Guard first, right at the Anglo-Allied center where the fighting had been heaviest. He wanted them to break through enemy lines, crush their morale, and create an opening for the rest of the French army to exploit.
So the Imperial Guard, these supposedly invincible soldiers, against Wellington's battle-hardened troops. This is a clash of titans. Who won?
It's a moment that historians still debate. The Imperial Guard had momentum and a fearsome reputation, but they met really tough resistance. They were up against determined British and Dutch-Belgian troops who had already been fighting for hours.
So it wasn't just about the Guard's reputation. The Allied troops actually stood their ground against this legendary force. What made the difference?
A few things. First, the terrain wasn't on their side. They had to attack uphill, across ground that was muddy and messed up from the artillery fire and the earlier cavalry charges. That slowed them down and messed up their formations.
So even the Imperial Guard couldn't just ignore the problems of a chaotic battlefield. What else worked against them?
They also ran into intense fire from the Allied troops, especially the British foot guards. These guys were some of the best in the British Army, known for their discipline and accuracy. They just kept firing volley after volley into those advancing guard columns, lots of casualties, and it really disrupted their attack.
So it wasn't just about being brave, but about firepower, discipline, and maybe a bit of luck too. What happened in the end? Did the Guard break through?
No, they didn't. They fought bravely, but their attack ultimately failed. The terrain, the constant fire from the Allies, it all took a toll. Their formations started to break down, and then, under all that pressure and with so many losses, they started to fall back.
The Imperial Guard retreating. That must have been a shock for both sides. Was that the end of the battle? Did Napoleon give up at that point?
It was a huge turning point, both in terms of the actual fighting and the psychology of the battle. Seeing the Imperial Guard, who everyone thought were unbeatable, retreating like that, it had a ripple effect through the entire French army. It was a blow to their morale, a sign that even their best troops could lose.
Wow, I can only imagine. It's like seeing Superman get knocked down. If the Imperial Guard could be defeated, what hope was there for the rest of the army? What did Napoleon do? Did he try to rally his troops or admit defeat?
As the Imperial Guard retreated, Napoleon threw in his last reserves, some of the old guard, to try and stabilize the situation. But it was too late. The tide had turned. Wellington saw this and ordered a general advance all along the Anglo-Allied line.
So Wellington went on the offensive after the Guard's attack failed.
Exactly. The Allied troops, they could sense victory, and they pushed forward, driving the French back. The French army was falling apart, their morale was shattered, and they started to retreat in chaos. What had been this back-and-forth battle turned into a rout.
I can picture it. Soldiers running, horses panicking, the battlefield covered with dead and wounded. What about Napoleon? Where was he during all this? Did he fight to the end or try to escape?
That's a question that's fascinated historians for a long time. Some say he was near his headquarters at La Belle Alliance, trying desperately to rally his troops. Others say he left the field pretty early, knowing that the battle was lost and that staying wouldn't change anything.
So did he abandon his men, or was he being practical, trying to save what he could and maybe fight another day?
It's complicated. Napoleon was a complex guy, brilliant, charismatic, but also ruthless when he had to be. His actions at Waterloo have been interpreted in many ways. Some say he was a coward, others say he was just being pragmatic. He realized the battle was lost, and he had to focus on saving what was left of the French army and maybe his own political career.
It's not just about troop movements and tactics. It's about understanding the people, their motives, the decisions they made under pressure. That's what makes history so interesting, those human stories that play out within these huge events.
So with the French retreating, what did the coalition do? Did they just let them go?
No way, they chased them down. The British, the Prussians, all of them pressed their advantage, chasing the French for miles. The Prussian cavalry was particularly effective, capturing artillery, equipment, and thousands of prisoners. There's even a story about them capturing Napoleon's abandoned carriage with a copy of Machiavelli's The Prince still inside.
Wow, that detail really brings it to life. Napoleon's carriage, left behind in a hurry, a symbol of his defeat, with a book about power and strategy lying open inside. It's those little details that make history come alive and remind us that real people lived through these events.
That's the power of history, right? It's not just dates and battles and treaties. It's about the human stories, the victories and defeats, the choices and the consequences. For sure. So what happened after the French were defeated? What happened to Napoleon? What about Europe? How did this one battle, this fight on a muddy field in Belgium, change the course of history?
Waterloo truly marked the end of an era. It destroyed Napoleon's hopes of rebuilding his empire, and it led to a period of peace and stability in Europe. It also changed the continent's political landscape forever.
So Waterloo was more than just a battle. It was a turning point. Okay, you've got me hooked. I want to hear about the aftermath, the legacy of Waterloo, but I think we'll need a little more time for all that.
Definitely. We'll pick up the story in part two and explore the lasting legacy of Waterloo, how it changed the map of Europe, influenced military thinking, and how it's still remembered today.
That's a plan. Until next time, listeners, keep those history books open, and we'll see you on the other side of the battlefield for part two.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the Battle of Waterloo. Last time, we left the French army facing attacks from both Wellington's forces and the Prussians. Napoleon's big plan was crumbling, and the outcome of the whole battle was hanging in the balance.
It was definitely a turning point. Every decision, every move could have changed everything. So you were saying Napoleon had one last trick up his sleeve. What was it? What did he have left that could turn things around?
Well, his carefully crafted plan was in shambles. The French army was under pressure from all sides, and so Napoleon decided to gamble everything on one final, desperate move. He called upon his most elite troops, the legendary Imperial Guard.
Ah, the Imperial Guard. Now we're talking. These were the absolute best, right? The top tier of the French army. I bet Napoleon was hoping they could deliver a knockout blow, maybe break through Wellington's lines and somehow snatch a victory from what looked like certain defeat.
Precisely. The Imperial Guard wasn't just some elite unit, they were a symbol. They represented Napoleon's power, the might of the French military. They were known for their discipline, their distinctive bearskin hats, and their unwavering loyalty to the emperor. Sending them into battle at this point was a clear sign that Napoleon was throwing everything he had left at the enemy.
I can only imagine what it must have been like to witness that moment. The Imperial Guard marching forward, carrying the hopes of the entire French army, the fate of the battle, maybe even the fate of Europe on their shoulders. It must have been an awe-inspiring sight.
It was a high-risk gamble, a final, all-or-nothing assault. Napoleon committed elements of the Middle Guard first, sending them against the Anglo-Allied center where the fighting had been most intense. Their objective was to break through the enemy lines, shatter their morale, and create a gap for the rest of the French army to exploit.
So we've got the Imperial Guard, these legendary warriors, going up against Wellington's battle-hardened troops, a true clash of titans who came out on top.
That's a moment that historians have been debating ever since. The Imperial Guard, they had the momentum and their reputation preceded them, but they were met with fierce resistance. They faced seasoned British and Dutch Belgian troops who had already been fighting for hours and weren't about to give up easily.
So it wasn't just about the Guard's reputation or their elite status. The Allied troops stood firm against this legendary force. What made the difference?
Well, a few things. First, the terrain wasn't in their favor. They had to advance uphill, across ground that was muddy and turned up from the artillery fire and the cavalry charges that came before. It slowed them down and disrupted their formations, making them more vulnerable.
So even the Imperial Guard couldn't just ignore the challenges of a battlefield like that. What else worked against them?
They also faced devastating firepower from the Allied troops, especially from the British Foot Guards. These regiments were some of the best in the British Army, famous for their discipline and marksmanship. They unleashed volley after volley of musket fire into those advancing guard columns, causing heavy casualties and disrupting their attack.
So it wasn't just about bravery or dash. Firepower, discipline, maybe even a bit of luck played a role. So what happened? Did the Guard manage to break through?
They did not. They fought with incredible courage, but their attack eventually stalled. Their formations, disrupted by the terrain and the constant fire from the Allied troops, began to falter. Under increasing pressure and suffering significant losses, they began to pull back.
The Imperial Guard retreating. That must have sent shockwaves through both armies. Was that the moment when Napoleon's hopes were finally crushed?
It was a pivotal moment, both in terms of the fighting and the psychology of the battle. To see the Imperial Guard, who everyone thought were invincible, retreating in disarray, it had a huge impact on the French army. It was a crushing blow to their morale. If their best troops couldn't win, what hope was there for the rest of them?
I can only imagine the impact. It's like seeing Superman fall. If the Imperial Guard can be defeated, then what chance does anyone else have? So what did Napoleon do? Did he try to rally his troops, or was it finally time to admit defeat?
With the Imperial Guard falling back, Napoleon threw in his last reserves, elements of the Old Guard, in a desperate attempt to salvage the situation. But the tide had turned. Wellington, sensing the shift in momentum, ordered a general advance along the entire Anglo-Allied line.
So with the Guards' attack failing, the initiative shifted to Wellington. It was his turn to go on the offensive.
Exactly. The Allied troops, sensing victory was within their grasp, surged forward, pushing the French back across the battlefield. The French, their morale shattered and their formations crumbling, began to fall back in increasing disorder. What had been a fierce back-and-forth battle now descended into a chaotic rout.
I'm picturing scenes of utter chaos, soldiers fleeing, horses panicking, the ground littered with the wounded and the dead. What about Napoleon? Where was he during this final collapse? Did he fight to the bitter end or try to escape the carnage?
That's a question that's been debated by historians for centuries. Some accounts place him near La Belle Alliance, an inn that served as his headquarters during the battle, desperately trying to rally his troops. Others suggest he left the field earlier, recognizing that the battle was lost and that his presence wouldn't change the outcome.
So, did he abandon his men? Or was it a calculated decision to preserve what he could and live to fight another day?
It's a complex question. Napoleon was a complicated figure, a brilliant strategist, a charismatic leader, but also someone who could make ruthless decisions when he had to. Historians have interpreted his actions at Waterloo in many different ways. Some accuse him of cowardice, while others argue he was simply being pragmatic, recognizing that the battle was lost and that he needed to focus on saving what he could of the French army and perhaps his own political future.
It's a reminder that history isn't just about military tactics and troop movements on a map. It's also about understanding people, their motivations, the decisions they made under immense pressure. That's what makes it so fascinating, those human stories that unfold within these larger events. So with the French army in retreat, what did the coalition forces do? Did they just let them go, or did they pursue them relentlessly?
They pursued them relentlessly. The British, the Prussians, and the other coalition armies pressed their advantage, harassing the fleeing French for miles. The Prussian cavalry in particular was incredibly effective in this pursuit, capturing artillery, equipment, and thousands of prisoners. There's even a story about Napoleon's abandoned carriage being captured, with a copy of Machiavelli's The Prince still inside.
Wow, that's an amazing detail. Really captures the chaos of that moment. Napoleon's carriage, abandoned in haste, a symbol of his shattered ambitions, with a book on power and strategy left open inside. It's almost too perfect, a bit symbolic. But it's those kinds of details that bring history to life, that remind us that these events were experienced by real people.
Exactly. That's the power of history. It's not just dates and battles and treaties. It's about the human stories, the triumphs and tragedies, the choices people made, and the consequences they faced.
Absolutely. So with the French defeated, what were the immediate consequences of Waterloo? What happened to Napoleon, to Europe? How did this single battle, this clash on a muddy field in Belgium, end up reshaping the course of history?
Welcome back to our deep dive into the Battle of Waterloo. When we left off, we were talking about the immediate consequences of this decisive battle.
Yeah, we've covered the fighting, the key players, and now it's time to zoom out and look at the bigger picture, the lasting legacy of Waterloo. How did this single event end up changing the world?
It's a question that's worth thinking about. Waterloo wasn't just a military victory, it was a turning point in European history. It brought an end to an era of almost constant warfare and ushered in a period of relative peace and stability.
So, like closing a chapter on a really chaotic period,
Yeah.
how did it actually change the political landscape of Europe? What happened once the fighting was over?
Well, imagine a continent that's just exhausted from decades of conflict. Boundaries have been redrawn, empires have risen and fallen, millions of lives lost. The defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo gave everyone a chance to reset, a chance to build a new order that would prevent such widespread conflict from happening again.
So it wasn't just about punishing France or changing borders. They were actually trying to create a system that would stop another Napoleon from coming to power.
That's exactly it. That's where the Congress of Vienna comes in. It was a meeting of diplomats and leaders from the winning powers, Britain, Prussia, Austria, Russia. They wanted to establish a lasting peace. They wanted to restore a balance of power in Europe to make sure no single country could dominate the others.
Okay, so we have these diplomats sitting around redrawing maps, making alliances. Did it work? Did the Congress of Vienna actually achieve what it's set out to do?
It's remarkable, but yeah, to a large extent they did. There were still some smaller conflicts and uprisings, but Europe enjoyed a period of peace and stability that was pretty much unheard of for almost 40 years after Waterloo. This era is often called the Concert of Europe. It was all about cooperation and diplomacy instead of the constant warfare they'd seen in the century before.
So after all that fighting, the continent finally got a break to breathe and rebuild. What happened during that extended period of peace? Did it lead to other types of progress?
Absolutely. The 19th century saw a huge boom in technology, industry, and the sharing of ideas. That peace, which really started after the Napoleonic Wars ended at Waterloo, created the perfect conditions for those transformations.
It sounds like Waterloo, in a way, paved the way for a century of progress and innovation. It's amazing how these events can have such huge ripple effects. I'm also curious about how it affected military thinking. How did Waterloo change the way wars were fought after that?
It's a great question. A lot of people see Waterloo as a transitional battle, a bridge between the grand maneuvers of Napoleon's time and the more industrialized, technology-driven warfare we saw in the 20th century.
We talked before about how Waterloo was a clash of styles, with Napoleon's veterans going up against a more diverse, technologically advanced coalition force. Do you think this battle foreshadowed how wars would be fought in the future?
In some ways, yes. Waterloo really showed how important combined arms tactics were. That means using infantry, cavalry, and artillery together effectively, something that would only become more critical as technology improved and battlefields became more complex.
It's like they were figuring out the basics of modern warfare right there on the fields of Waterloo. Beyond the military and political stuff, I'm also interested in its cultural impact. How did Waterloo shape the way we remember history? How has it been portrayed over time?
Waterloo became a legend almost instantly. It represented triumph and tragedy, a source of national pride, but also a reminder of the terrible cost of war. It's inspired countless works of art, literature, and music.
I can see why. The imagery is so powerful, the scale so epic. It's a story that has captured people's imaginations for centuries. Even today, people visit the battlefield, walk those grounds, and try to understand the sheer scale of what happened there.
And even the phrase meeting one's Waterloo has become part of our everyday language. It's a reminder that even the most powerful people and institutions can face ultimate defeat.
It really is amazing how one event can have such a long-lasting impact, both on the world and on how we think about the past. It makes you think about which events from our own time will be remembered centuries from now. As we wrap up our deep dive into Waterloo, is there one final thought, one key takeaway you'd like to leave our listeners with?
Well, I think it's this. While we tend to focus on the armies, the tactics, the moments of heroism, the true significance of Waterloo is really about what came after. It's a reminder that the consequences of war reach far beyond the battlefield, shaping nations and changing the course of history.
Well said. And on that note, I think we've done a pretty good job exploring this epic event. We've talked about the people involved, the choices they made, the clash of armies, and the lasting impact that still affects our world today. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Battle of Waterloo.
My pleasure. It's been great discussing this with you.
And to all our listeners, until next time, keep exploring history, and we'll see you on our next deep dive into the past.